Hi, this is my presentation or reflection about the World Language Teaching Unit for Education 5612 at The Ohio State University. I taught El Tiempo, or the weather, for my students in my high school placement. How effective were you in documenting the progress made by your students? Throughout my World Language Teaching Unit, I tried to be very explicit about documenting student progress so I could more effectively assess my teaching and their preferred learning strategies. My information gap activity, the Jamboard activity, and ultimately the integrated performance assessment were all written, documented examples of students' development and proficiency throughout the 2 weeks of the WLTU. I also took notes as I taught and led discussion, asked my mentor teacher to take notes, and I was observed by our supervisor, Joe, 3 times throughout the unit, who also provided helpful observations about my teaching. All of this feedback, combined with the documented progress of my students throughout the other activities, helped me to analyze and reflect on their concrete development of proficiency in the 4 modes of communication. My criteria to demonstrate student learning, using consistent and formative assessments as comprehension checks is a really crucial aspect of my philosophy of teaching because I'm constantly evaluating the most effective strategies for my students to learn and assessing their communicative development of the language. Unfortunately, when completing Section 5 of the WLTU, I failed to account for this criteria in my analysis of student success. I overlooked some of these important factors when documenting my students' progress. My final percentage of students that exceeded and or met my growth target on the IPA was 62%, but I ignored the importance of these other activities and formative assessments that also demonstrated student learning and development of proficiency. The second factor that skewed my data was my actual grading of the projects. I failed to use the rubric equation, which would have drastically increased my overall percentage of success, which I talked about a little bit in Section 6 of the WLTU. If we move on to my actual SLO table, the original one, looking at this original assessment of student success that I submitted for Section 5, only 16 out of my 26 students met or exceeded my growth targets. However, this scale only judged their project submission for the IPA, which was only partially implemented and only measured the interpretive and presentational modes of communication. I had 9 student learning objectives for the unit, and the IPA barely measured 4 of them. But luckily, I learned from my mistake and adjusted both my students' grades and my SLO scoring table. Looking at the updated analysis of the data, there were obvious developments that I missed in my original student learning objective scoring. As I said, I changed student grades to reflect the use of the rubric equation in scoring. I also added a column to assess the development of proficiency throughout my formative assessments, which was really important to their development and I neglected the first time, both with class participation and their submitted work on the information gap activity and the Jamboard. With just these few minor adjustments to my analysis, I was wrong about 4 students who actually succeeded at meeting or exceeding my growth targets throughout my teaching of the WLTU. And my percentage of students that exceeded and met the targets on the IPA actually rose to 77%. And honestly, there could have been more students who developed their communicative proficiency, but it just might have been too difficult to observe and measure in an online setting. Moving on, what interpretations and conclusions did you draw from your data? I've concluded that I'm dumb. No, I'm just kidding. This is the point of reflection and analysis. It was a really great lesson for me as a future teacher. This mistake and how I adapted has made me more prepared to teach in the future. Using assessments to make decisions about teaching. As I said, I like to use formative assessments as comprehension checks as often as possible to evaluate the strengths and most effective strategies for my students, as well as any possible areas of improvement that I would need to focus my resources on. And without the benefit of in-person observation as an analysis, my WLTU assessments had to be much more explicit at measuring understanding. I use specific yes-no, forced choice, and then open-ended questions for the vocabulary instruction, and then a Jamboard activity to access prior knowledge and reiterate vocabulary, and then finally the culture discussion. These were all forms of formative assessments that I used to help students learn, check for understanding, and also to guide the rest of my lessons and teaching for the rest of the unit. And then I used Sean's model of reflection in action and reflection on action to adapt my preceding activities and lessons to better achieve student success. For example, again, as I talked about in my WLTU write-ups, after my assessment of understanding on their first day of vocabulary instruction and the Jamboard, my mentor teacher and I just decided that students weren't ready to complete the information gap activity, so we shifted the focus before I implemented it. After reflecting on the final products that my students submitted, I think they demonstrated far more successful proficiency after we had adjusted the task. All of these observations, analyses, and reflections with my mentor teacher about my formative assessments led to far better language development for my students. And finally, learning from data collection and analysis. As I said, I've learned a lot from implementing the WLTU, specifically from 1, adjusting activities to better educate my students, and 2, especially from the mistakes I made when analyzing their learning and my reflections. After completing this data collection and analysis, I'm much more confident in implementing another integrated performance assessment into my curriculum in the spring, and to hopefully assess all 4 modes of communication as I had originally planned for my WLTU. This data also reflects that I was proactive in the methods that I used to document student progress throughout the unit, but I failed to use these contributors when assessing the success of my IPA. But the good news is this is an easy fix that I can utilize to have more successful lessons, activities, and assessments in the future. Throughout this unit, I've learned how to analyze and use the standards efficiently, create activities and lessons with comprehensible input to increase student learning and the connections that they make with the material, develop formative and summative assessments to ensure student comprehension, and use constant reflection to perfect my teaching along every step of this process. After an entire semester in my placement, and with the knowledge that I've gained from completing the World Language Teaching Unit, I'm excited to take the full responsibility of teaching these students in the spring. Thank you.